Hello, good people. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you and yours. And welcome to another episode of the God Pulse podcast. My name is Bolelo and I'm your host. And thank you for allowing me into your space yet again. You and I are going to have a conversation for yet another week. And we'll just kind of pick at each other's brains about certain things in the Christian faith, things that we experience, and, all that good stuff. So without any further ado, let us get talking. So you and I are going to be engaging with one another based on the story of Asa, king of Judah, and his story is found in 2 Chronicles, and we're going to be looking at chapters 14 to 16. And the focal point of this episode will be the cost of distrust. And so if you know the story of King Asa, it might seem a little odd because we know King Asa to be someone who trusts God, but towards the end, towards his death, we learn that he abandoned his trust for God. So we're going to be talking about that today and, just talking about the very different aspects of his journey as a king, as someone who trusted God up till the very end, till his death. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 14, verse 2, we start learning about Asa, king of Judah, son of Abijah, and it says that he did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord. It says that he tore down foreign altars and the high places. So these are places that were dedicated to idol worship. And he smashed, removed, and cut down the things associated with idol worship, right? So he commanded Judah to seek the Lord and to obey his law and his commandments. It says in verse 6 that there was no one at war with him during these years. So I don't know how many years, but it says that during those years, no one was at war with him because the Lord gave him rest. And in verse 5, it said that the kingdom was at peace under him. And so when we get to verse 8, we learn that Asa had an army of about 3,000 men from Judah. They were equipped with large shields with spears, and 280,000 men from Benjamin who were armed with small shields and with bows. All brave fighting men. Then Zerah the Cushite in verse 9 marched out against Asa and his army, and with an army of thousands upon thousands and 300 chariots, it says, as far as Merisha. Asa went to meet with Zerah and his army, and they took up their battle positions. And then in verse 11, it demonstrates Asa, the king of Judah's trust in the Lord. He called out to the Lord in verse 11. He said, Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this vast army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you. And then in verse 12, we see God's response. Right, so the Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled. And in verse 13, it says, and Asa and his army pursued them as far as Gerar. Such a great number of Cushites fell that they could not recover. They were crushed before the Lord and his forces. The men of Judah carried off a large amount of plunder. And so here, by verse 12 and verse 13, we recognize that Asa experienced God's faithfulness when he struck down the Cushites before him and before his army. So then we move on to chapter 15, right off verse 1 and verse 2. It starts off with a prophecy from a person named Azariah. He's the son of Odeb, right? And he went to meet with King Asa. And he said to him, listen to me, Asa, and all Judah and Benjamin. The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. And then Azariah goes on to say, for a long time, Israel was without the true God, without a priest to teach, and without the law. But in their distress, they turned to the Lord, the God of Israel, and sought him, and he was found by them. In those days, it was not safe to travel about, for all the inhabitants of the lands were in great turmoil. One nation was being crushed by another, and one city by another, because God was troubling them with every kind of distress. And in verse 7 it says, but as for you, be strong and do not give up, for your work will be rewarded. This prophecy that came from Azariah encouraged Asa to remove the detestable idols from the whole land of Judah and Benjamin and from the towns that he had captured in Ephraim. And he repaired the altar of the Lord in front of the portico, or maybe the porch or the veranda, if you prefer, of the Lord's temple. And then in verse 10, we learn that he assembled all Judah, Benjamin, and the people from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon who had settled among them. They had come over to him in large numbers from Israel because they saw that the Lord his God was indeed great. And so for the rest of this chapter, we see that the people sacrificed to the Lord. They entered into a covenant to seek the Lord, the God of their ancestors, with all their heart and all their souls. And this is what it says in verse 12. They took an oath to the Lord, and all of Judah rejoiced because they had sworn wholeheartedly. They sought God eagerly, and he was found by them, it says in verse 15. And so the Lord gave them rest on every side. And so even here, we're reminded of the prophecy of Azariah, son of Oded, in verse 2, where he says that if you seek him, he will be found by you. And so these people sought the Lord, and indeed, he was found by them. And so that's kind of a background of King Asa and his devotion to God, and how people saw how great his God was and how they devoted themselves to this God. But from chapter 16, we begin to see a bit of a change. From the first verse, it reads, "In the 36th year of Asa's reign, Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and fortified Ramah to prevent anyone from leaving or entering the territory of Asa, king of Judah. Asa then took the silver and gold out of the treasuries of the Lord's temple and of his own palace and sent it to Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, who was ruling in Damascus. 'Let there be a treaty between me and you,' he said, 'as there was between my father and your father. See, I am sending you silver and gold. Now break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so he will withdraw from me.' Ben-Hadad agreed with King Asa and sent the commanders of his forces against the towns of Israel. They conquered Ijan, Dan, Abel Maim, and all the store cities of Naphtali. When Baasha heard this, he stopped building Ramah and abandoned his work. Then King Asa brought all the men of Judah, and they carried away from Ramah the stones and timber Baasha had been using. With them he built up Geba and Mizpah." And then in verse 7 it says, "At that time Hanani the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, 'Because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand. Were not the Cushites and the Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet you relied on the Lord. He delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on, you will be at war.'" And then this is where we begin to see a change in King Asa's character. It says in verse 10, Asa was angry with the seer because of this. He was so enraged that he put him in prison. At the same time, Asa brutally oppressed some of the people. And it's just interesting how when the Spirit of the Lord fell upon Azariah, who came and gave him a prophecy, that prophecy encouraged Asa to tear down things that were dedicated to idol worship. But now, with Hanani, the seer, who came to talk to him, he became enraged and he threw him in prison. And what I recognize in Asa the king is that here he began to become comfortable with not relying on the Lord as he used to. Remember how in verse 9 it says, for the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on you will be at war. And so I wonder, as we begin to look at the character changes in Asa, if at this point he was no longer being strengthened in his heart by the Lord because he was no longer fully committed to him. So as we read on in the chapter, we also learn that King Asa fell ill. It says in verse 12, in the 39th year of his reign, Asa was afflicted with a disease in his feet. Though his disease was severe, even in his illness, he did not seek help from the Lord, but only from physicians. And so we recognize that even as he goes along, he completely abandons the trust that he used to have for God. And though the seer said that from now on you will be at war, in this particular chapter, it does not go on to talk about the wars that they experienced. But now it kind of closes off the life of King Asa. It says that in the first year of his reign, Asa died and rested with his ancestor. So that's kind of where it ends in this particular chapter, though. So if you read this particular chapter, you might think that maybe there were no serious repercussions to Asa not trusting in the Lord the way that he used to. But the thing that I noticed about King Asa in his journey from being someone who was described to be in chapter 14, verse 2, who was good and right in the eyes of the Lord, to being someone who brutally oppressed some of the people, I reckon that there was a character change that happened within King Asa when he began to abandon his trust in God. It's as though he forgot what God had done for him when he was faced with the army of the Cushites that were greater than his army, and began to trust in his own abilities, his own connections when Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah. The story of King Asa makes me realize that we can start off with trust in God and fully rely on him. But it is possible that along the way, we abandon our trust, our faith in God, and begin to rely on our own means, our own ways, our own methods, forgetting or rather neglecting all that the Lord has done for us before, how faithful he has been to us before. I realize that we begin to rely on ourselves, that awe-inspired reverence for the Lord kind of begins to fade, or we begin to believe in ourselves, our own abilities, our connections to do what only God could do, or to do what was supposed to be reserved for God. And so I asked the question, what are some of the areas in your life where you have decided to drop God and take up your own wisdom, where you have not trusted in the Lord your God with all your heart and leaned not on your own understanding? I think that God knows that when we lose trust in him and we begin to trust in ourselves, we risk entering into a deep and scary place of self-worship, where guaranteed our character will be subject to some form of change. Our hearts will be subject to change, and we risk entering into a dangerous place of change as opposed to being changed and being renewed to look more and more like God. We risk looking more and more unlike God. Listen, I think that along with trusting God because he is God and because he is sovereign, that he is the creator and ruler of all things, I think that trusting in God also protects us from a lot of things. It protects us from ourselves, our selfish desires, our evil hearts, our idolatry, falling for the tricks and the plots of the one who disguises or masquerades himself as an angel of light, so Satan, because those things appeal to what our flesh wants. They appeal to our desire and for our love for instant gratification sometimes. And so I really believe that us trusting in God is meant for our protection, to shield us from anything that could potentially pull us away from his presence. In 2 Chronicles chapter 15, verse 2, Azariah, son of Oded, said this to King of Asa. When the Spirit of the Lord fell upon him, he said, "The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you." So when King Asa had forsaken God, not only did God take away the rest upon his kingdom because he began to oppress the people, not only did he take that away, but this act ended up in bringing about a nature of Asa that is different from the one that we encountered and that we're introduced to in verse 2 of chapter 14. It just makes me think that when will we begin to realize that us trusting in God does nothing for God with regards to his character, but everything for ours. It does everything for us. That trusting in God is for our own good, not God's. And if I think on why that is, I think that it's because trusting in Him robs us of the opportunity to be our own gods. It keeps us in line with the only one true God. Our lives are expressed in worship of Him, of God, and not ourselves. And that's it. That's how it should be, right? So as we come to a close, think about your life. Where have you abandoned God and trusted in your own abilities to bring about a life that you think you ought to live? Have you yourself noticed any changes within yourself, within your heart, your mind, in seasons where you began to rely on yourself and your abilities and your connections and your way of perceiving life and things like that? The story makes me realize that just because we trust in God today does not mean that we will never ever not trust in God. It makes me realize that as human beings, we tend to want to trust in ourselves. We tend to want to fix situations ourselves and try to make a way apart from God's help or apart from His direction and His leadership. It makes me realize that it is possible to lose your trust in God when you begin believing that you can do it yourself. But the thing is, we're not meant to do it by ourselves. We weren't created for ourselves. We're created for God. And so whatever that we're created to do, we can only do in the capacity of trusting God. We can only live lives that are successful, fulfilling, when we do them in accordance to His will. When we trust Him to bring about His will in our lives, when we trust Him to bring about His plan and purpose in our lives. I reckon that the cost of distrust can be a change within yourself. It can be a character change. It can be a change in your heart, in your mind. It can be a change that moves you away from God's presence. There's a cost of not trusting God. And the sooner we realize that we were not designed to live our lives outside of His leadership, of His guidance, outside of His presence, the easier it will be, even when we're faced with challenges and we're afflicted on every side. We ought to remember all the times that God delivered us from afflictions back then. We ought to remember God's faithfulness, that God has been faithful. He was faithful then. He will definitely be faithful now. I have a tendency of not trusting God. I'm not exempted from this. I have a tendency of thinking that my ways are better. But the thing is, you will keep on experiencing the same things. You will keep on stumbling over the same blocks in your life. You'll continue to fall into the same toxic, dangerous, and destructive cycles when you keep relying on yourself and you think that it's okay to not trust in God. So let us not abandon our trust and our faith in God. Let us choose to remember His faithfulness, even in a situation that seems impossible. Know that trusting God is for you, for your edification, for your growth. And the same applies when you don't trust God. It affects you, and you will experience the consequences of that. So that brings us to the very end of our episode today. I hope that it causes you to reflect on some of the decisions that you make, the choices that you make in your life, the kind of life that you're living, the kind of person that you are currently, if it is a result of not trusting God, and if it is a result of you trusting God, to kind of really examine yourself. Reading the story of King Asa and many others in the Word of God has made me sort of realize that, okay, so there's not only the being or falling into the habit of not trusting God, but sometimes you will encounter changes within yourself when you don't trust God, that there's a cost to your distrust. And if that is the case, then there must be a blessing of trusting in God. If we think about the stories of Abraham and Noah and how they trusted God, how they had faith in Him and how God honored them because of that, don't we want that for ourselves as well? So let us lean on God in order to trust in Him, because I don't think that it just happens automatically. I think God teaches us how to trust in Him. So let us lean on Him to help us to learn how to trust in Him. And if you ever need some encouragement about that, maybe read Hebrews chapter 11. And it talks about how all these people in the days of old were commended for their faith in God. So we're finally coming to a close. And the song I would love to recommend to you to listen to is a song by River Valley Worship. It's called Shadows Spotlights. It's amazing. So listen to that, tune into that, and I hope you love it. And I hope that this episode was helpful. So until next time, I hope you have a great rest of your week. I hope that you begin to walk in ways that display your trust for God, that you trust Him in the little things and the big things. Know that God loves you. He loves you insanely. And I love you too. So until next week.